Well, we are amid a new series, and if you recall, last month we talked about the one thing. We had a question with that, and one of the things that we came out from there with was this idea of what's the one thing that we can do to connect? What's the one thing that we can do to grow our spiritual life? And that is, one of the ways is to connect with Jesus, and we're going to talk about that in more detail today. However, before we get there, we're going to take a little side trip. Anybody familiar with the name Jane Austen? She wrote in the 1800s 6 novels that I would be surprised if you didn't at least know her name. You may not have read anything or seen anything by her, but I will tell you that 2024, for some reason, is seeing a resurgence of Jane Austen remakes of movies and all these types of things, or variations on spin-offs of various books of hers. One of the books that she wrote that is still very endearing, one of the things about Jane Austen is she wrote characters that today we can still relate to. We look at them and they're in a different time period, they're in a, we call the Regency time period, and yet somehow we can still see ourselves and learn things from it. She's a very witty writer, she used satire, she had characters that were quite relatable and sometimes also quite outrageous. And one of her best known books, not the best, Pride and Prejudice is probably, if you know any of her books, that's the top book most people know. But one of the other books that people know a lot about is the book Emma. And if you don't worry, I'm going to give you a little spoiler alert. And if you don't even care about Emma, that's all right, because you're going to know it all here in just a moment. So when Jane Austen wrote Emma, she said somewhere in her letters that I wrote a heroine that I don't think anybody but myself could actually like. Well, Jane Austen was often right about many things, but she was incorrect about Emma. Emma is quite a character that many people relate to. And here's how this goes. In a nutshell, Emma is, at the beginning of this book, a 21-year-old woman who is independently wealthy, if you will. Doesn't have to worry for anything. Her father dotes on her. She has an older sister. She has a brother-in-law. The brother-in-law and sister have kids, and she's loved by all these people. She's very rich. She's also quite snobby. And one of her dear friends is a man called Mr. Knightley, who actually also happens to be her brother-in-law's brother, if you're following that for a second. And throughout the book, Emma gets herself in a number of scrapes. Now, she doesn't know that she's going to get herself in these scrapes. And the first scrape she gets herself into is she decides that since her governess had married one of their neighbors and it had went so well and that she had somehow had a tiny part in that she was going to run around and be a matchmaker. And so she goes, okay, I'm going to start matchmaking. So she makes this friend, and she has her eye on the clergyman named Mr. Elton. Long story short, throughout this process, she gets everything entirely wrong. And in fact, as she's trying to get her friend with Mr. Elton proposes to her instead of to her friend. Big problem. Now, in the midst of all this, her friend Mr. Knightley, who visits them often tells Emma, you are completely off track. You are a spoiled child. And you might say, wow, what kind of friend is this? But you know, everything that Mr. Knightley is telling her as you go further along, you realize is true. He goes, you can't just play with people's emotions and just tell them that, you know, you and you are going to end together because I just say so. That's not how this works, Emma. But Emma goes, oh, you don't know anything. I know better than you do. Repeatedly, to the point that by the end of the book, here's a spoiler, Emma says, I give up. I am not doing this ever again. And long story short, as you can imagine, she ends up falling in love with Mr. Knightley, partly because Mr. Knightley's the only person in her life that actually tells her the truth. When she is behaving badly, he always calls her out and tells her, Emma, that was poorly done, that was not appropriate. Almost every time. Now, some people might say that's obnoxious, that's annoying every time he's out there telling her what to do, but in the end it actually ends up connecting them together because she knows that he's always going to tell her how it is. So you might say, what on earth does Emma have to do with the Bible? We're coming to that. So remember, our focusing question that we had from last time is this. What's the one thing I can do that by doing it, everything else will be easier or unnecessary? And one of the areas that we are going to talk about today is connecting with Jesus, looking at that through the life of Peter. because Jesus was often very frank with Peter. But we're going to start at the very beginning here. We're going to go to John 1:35 to 42. So John 1:35 to 42 tells us actually how Peter even met Jesus. So it says, the next day John, this is John the Baptist, was there again with two of his disciples, and when he saw Jesus passing by, he said, "Look, the Lamb of God." When the two disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus said to them, "What do you want?" They said, "Teacher, where are you staying?" "Come," he replied, "and you will see." So they went and saw where he was staying and spent that day with him. It was about the 10th hour, and Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, here's our first mention of Peter, was one of the two who heard what John had said and who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother, Peter, and tell him, "We have found the Messiah," that is the Christ, and brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Peter." This is the first meeting of Jesus and Peter. And a little sidestep for a moment. I love this story because we see Peter comes because of a family member who experienced it for themselves and said, "This is so exciting, I need to go tell my brother." That's Andrew. And I could preach a whole other sermon on Andrew. I love Andrew. And Andrew often gets overshadowed by his brother, so I'm going to give him just a little bit of airtime at the moment. He's always bringing people to Jesus. And he brings his brother Peter to Jesus. And I think what's interesting here too, we don't really see what Peter's response is, but what we do see is we see the action. And that should be something. Peter's a man of action. We don't hear him say anything here at this point. We just see that Andrew, his brother, comes, finds him and says, "We've found him, we've found the Messiah." And obviously Peter was ready and knew what he was talking about. And what are you talking about? What does he do? He comes. He goes to see exactly what his brother is telling him about. And when he gets there, Jesus tells him straight off, "I'm already going to change your name." Name changes are a significant thing in the Bible, and we're not going to hit this as well. But he already tells him, "Your name is this, but I'm going to be calling you Peter." So this is our very first encounter with Peter and Jesus. And already we are seeing this pattern of Jesus is speaking. He always speaks truth, but he is speaking very much to Peter and the man that he is, and calling out things in Peter ahead of time. Peter means rock, right? He's already kind of calling out the strength for him. So let's go over to Luke 5, and we're going to look a little bit further. This is a little bit later in their time together. Not much so. It says the calling of the first disciples, but we see that he's been brought in by Andrew. He's gone back to fishing. He's kind of coming and going. He's not necessarily on the road with Jesus. So he's out doing fishing. And this is Luke 5, 3 to 10. And it says this. He got into one of the boats, this is Jesus, the one belonging to Peter, and asked him to pull out a little from shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Peter, Put out into deep water and let the nets down for a catch." Peter answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." And when they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were with him James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Peter, "Do not be afraid, for now you will catch men." So notice, again, what we see repeatedly from Peter is we see that he's a man of action. And we get to see some words from him, because after Jesus has preached and says, "Go back out into the deep water," he's like, "Whoa, hold on. I'm a fisherman. I've been doing this for a while. You don't catch fish just in the middle of the day, and we worked all night and we didn't catch anything." But what does he say about why he will do it? "Because you said so, I will let down the net. Which already tells us that they're building a relationship if Peter can say, oh, I'm not really sure what you're doing here, but I trust you or know you well enough that I'm going to do it. Have you ever been around somebody who was very flattering with their words? I've been around somebody who just, because they were always just kind of telling you what you want to hear, or you kind of suspect they're always just telling you, oh, you're so wonderful or something like that, that it makes you kind of go like, are you being real with me here? How easy is it to trust somebody who's just telling you those things? How easy it is to develop a relationship with somebody like that, right? You kind of go, are you just telling me these things to be telling me these things? And yet what we see here, right, is that Jesus doesn't actually respond to Peter there. But when Peter makes that statement, so he's obviously, Jesus is continuing to connect with him, speak truth to him, and they catch all those fish. What's his response? He's like, whoa, he's completely overwhelmed. They've had to call in this other boat to come there with them, and they put all these fish, and they've got more fish than they know what to do with. I mean, this is a huge catch, and he just needs to go away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man, because he realizes he's in the presence of somebody greater than he is. And yet Jesus speaks these words, don't be afraid. From now on, you're going to be a fisher of men. So Jesus continues to call out that within Peter that he's seeing. Yeah, you caught all these fish, but I'm going to call you to be preaching the word here soon, calling you to follow me. And we see in Matthew 16, we see his profession go even further. So Matthew 16, they are at this point, they've been on the road for a while. And this is 16 to 17. And they stop at Caesarea Philippi, and they're having this conversation, and Jesus is asking them, who do people say the Son of Man is? And this is Simon's reply to all of this. And he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus responds to him in this. He says, blessed are you, Simon Peter, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. At this point, would we say that they are absolutely friends, right? If he is talking to him and he says, who do the people say you are? And he recognizes in him, he goes, you are the Messiah. Now, this maybe isn't like it's a revelation, but where did we see him earlier? What did his brother tell him about Jesus to start with, right? He said to him, we've found the Messiah. That's what Andrew told him at the beginning. We don't see Peter say anything about that until here, where he says, you are. And Jesus says to him, this isn't revealed to you because somehow you just magically know this. God has given you this insight. And he goes on and says some other things in 18 about him. It says, I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. People sometimes get that confused and think he meant to build the rock on Peter, but what he means is built on that statement that Peter said, Jesus is the Messiah. And finally, as we're following Peter's life, we're going to fast forward a bit. We're going to go to Matthew 26. And this is right before, probably if any story you know about Peter, the one you tend to know is that Peter ends up denying Christ 3 times. But this is before this has happened. So he's developed this relationship. Jesus time and time again is telling him the truth, just not telling him things just because he wants to hear it, not just flattering him, calling out the best in him, knows that he's about to be tested, and says this in Matthew 26, 16 to 17. Oh, sorry. I am in the wrong spot here. It should actually be 33. Sorry, but it is 26. So Matthew 26, 33 and 34. So Jesus is predicting Peter's denial at this point. He's telling them, on this account, you all will fall away from me. And he tells them, but after I've risen, this is 32, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. And Peter, man of action, also man of quick words, says, even if I'll fall on account of you, I never will. I mean, he's quite dedicated. Like, he is like, Jesus, I am with you to the end, right? This is not just a loose connection here. He's very committed, or thinks he's very committed, maybe is a good way to say that. But this is his friend. And he says, I'm never going to do this to you. How could you say this to me? But Jesus isn't mincing words. And he says, I tell you the truth, talking straight to Peter, this very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And Peter's response, maybe he would have been better off to just nod and move on. But he has to say, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And all the other disciples said the same thing. And yet, what do we know? We know that obviously Jesus was correct. And Peter did deny him. But he did come back. And here's the thing. The beauty of this story, right, is that over and over again as Jesus is telling him the truth, Peter continues to connect and be deeply rooted. He messes up, sure. He says things that are really rash, absolutely. But we see later on when he writes in they wouldn't have been called 1 Peter, but in our Bible it's 1 Peter, we see various things that he says about this connecting with Christ. And so let's go to 1 Peter 1, 8-9, and it says, though you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and are filled with an inexpressible and glorious joy, for you are receiving the end result of your faith and the salvation of your souls. Think about this. This is a man who has failed terribly, who has been very rash, who has heard Jesus say very tough things to him. And in fact, in our Bible study last night, it was pointed out, like Jesus specifically had prayed for him that his faith would hold, because he knew that he was going to face this gigantic temptation. And yet in here he says, for those who haven't even seen Christ, and Peter had the advantage of seeing Christ, right? They love that you've loved them, and they're filled with this joy, and they receive the end result of the salvation of their souls. This is the connecting part, right? That this is us today. We haven't seen him with our own 2 eyes, and yet we can have that same joy and that same connection that Peter had with Jesus. Now in 1 Peter 1, 18-19, he says this, for you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. Peter gets it. He understands that the connection he has is not because he's a Jew. Right? He says this empty way that was handed down from your ancestors. It's not just because, oh, I'm so fabulous and I'm part of this church family or whatever, that he has that. He says, no. I am connected because of Christ. The blood of Christ, the sacrifice, the Messiah who he professed, and at the beginning of the story was told, we've seen the Messiah. He's preaching right here and says, yes, that is the connecting point. That is how we are going to make it. And then in 1 Peter 2:2 it says this, like newborn babies crave pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow up in your salvation. And I chose this one because I think this is a wonderful idea too. He is reminding us that connection doesn't just start out and you are just super strong and ready to go. I think of it this way. There is different ways that we interact with different people. And in the psychology terms, sometimes we'll call these like the 7 levels of intimacy or whatever. But you guys all understand this. You operate on this every day. So think about it this way. When you go to like the grocery store or you go to the post office and you just kind of see somebody that you like vaguely know, what types of things are you talking with that person about, right? You might just say, oh yeah, how's the weather? It's great. Yep, I'm fine, good. Like they're very surface things. You're not having really deep conversations. Think about people that you might know a little better. Maybe it's a church family, maybe it's somebody that you see a little more often. You might stop at the post office and talk with them a little bit and say, yeah, how's that new puppy doing? Oh, it's driving me nuts. It's keeping me up at night. You might be talking a little bit more about personal things. And then we go even further and maybe it's your partner, maybe it's your family, and the types of things you're talking about probably are at times, not all the time, deeper. Maybe you're talking about things that are really important to you. Maybe you have a dream of something that you want to do. Maybe we want to do something together and I'm talking with my partner about that. But you don't start at, or if somebody starts out that deep, you should be a little wary, just to let you know. You don't typically start out when you're getting to know somebody at level 7 of talking about like, here's my hopes and dreams and all my fondest whatevers. You tend to start off here, hi, my name is da-da-da, and as you get to know each other, you grow in trust, and then you can talk about other things besides the weather and just besides the new dog that's driving you crazy, to further along. And not everybody's going to be all the way about year 7, by the way. You don't have to share all your hopes and dreams with somebody that you've known forever. But there's these different levels we progress through. And I like that Peter is pointing this out, that we have to start somewhere. Your connection might just start off with, hey, God, nice to meet you. I'm Brooke. What can we learn today? Who are you? And hopefully you grow in your relationship with God, that you're talking about more than the weather, that you're talking about, this is what's going on in my life, that you're talking about, this is what I dream for and hope for, Lord, what about you? And Peter gets that. That's the type of connection he wants us to have. So if you remember that we saw this quote last time from Mother Teresa, and it says, yesterday is gone, tomorrow has not yet come, we have only today, so let us begin. So let's take what we've just learned here about Peter and that connecting. If that's the one thing that has to happen, what's the pieces that need to happen in order to connect? And these are the 3 things that I came up with. You've got to have time, you're going to have some testing, and you've got to have truth. Now there might be other pieces, but for the sake of time, we're going to only hit 3. And we see these in Peter's story, because remember, we saw Peter at the very beginning from he doesn't know anything about Jesus. His brother brings him in, and we don't even actually see him say anything to Jesus. As the relationship progresses, he's going, okay, yeah, sure, because you say so. I'm going to put the net over there, all the way to, well, you are the Messiah. I would die for you. Now, rash words later, but it took time to get there. Peter did not start with, yes, you are the Messiah and I'm going to die for you, because he didn't really know Jesus as the person. He was obviously looking for something. He had that in his heart, and he saw that connection. He grew into that relationship. So any relationship is going to take some time. There's testing that comes. And when I think of testing, we all know what Peter's test was, but it's about that consistency. When things get rough, whatever it may not be as dramatic as a betrayal in a friendship. It may just be something comes up in a misunderstanding. Maybe somebody didn't text you back in the time that you thought, and you're like, what is happening here? Or maybe someone said a harsh word in the heat of a moment, and you're like, do you know how to repair that, right? Do you know how to fix that? Can you keep with the consistency? Or when that happens, what's the thing that we say about friends who are here one moment, gone the other? Are you fair-weathered friend? We fair-weathered friends with God and say, okay, God, I'm with you as long as it's good and we're doing really well, but as soon as it gets hard, But we see with Peter and Jesus, the connection held true. It was rough. It was very rough. But we held on because of what? Repeatedly, Jesus is speaking truth to Peter. And Peter knows it. He's not just flattering him. And Peter knows also, by the end of this, that Jesus is who he says he is. Jesus is the Messiah. There's no doubt in his mind as he's talking about and connecting with Christ that this is the Messiah. This is what he is waiting on. And he stays connected because over and over again, the truth is being told to him. Now, not unlike, I know we're back to Emma for a second, not unlike Mr. Knightley, who repeatedly is telling Emma hard things that she doesn't always want to hear. But because he's willing to do that, he's consistent, took the time, and he said these things because he cared about her. The same thing applies to our relationship with God. It's because he cares about us that he tells us the truth. We can connect with him because of this, because he's truthful to us. He tells us things in the Bible, he tells us things in our prayer life, through others, all the ways that God speaks to us, that sometimes we go, I don't really want to hear this now, but because you say so, like Peter, okay, I'm going to trust you and take that into account. And we connect with him through those times of testing. If you've ever been through a rough patch in a relationship, a rough patch with anybody, if you make it through the rough patch, you tend to be quite a bit more bonded because you made it together. And it's the same thing with Jesus and Peter, and the same thing with us and God. When we make it through those patches, we're like, we did it, right? You've been tested and you made it through and you're stronger together. And we connect with Jesus, of course, because the only way we're going to make it through together is we're spending the time together to do so. That's key. If we're not spending the time with somebody, we're not going to connect with somebody that we're not spending any time with. That just doesn't happen. But Peter and Jesus spent time together. And in the end, that is what continued to maintain and keep Peter connected with Jesus. And may we have the same going forward, that one focus, our one focus is to connect, whatever it takes through those trials, to connect with Jesus. Just want to remind you, we're not done. These will be spread out. Upcoming, we're going to talk further about this, and we're going to see, we've already done Peter, but we'll be talking about Paul, and we'll be talking about Priscilla, and the one thing that helped them in their relationship with Christ.